Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, and our goal every week is to inspire you with cool stories of innovation, entrepreneurship, education, or whatever else we find that we think relates to service in some way. So we are excited to bring to you a talk today from Max Nova. And Max is a guy who has been studying all sorts of cool things related to forestry and artificial intelligence and bringing these together in all sorts of interesting ways. We're going to hear about timber. We're going to hear about economics. We're going to hear about a lot of cool innovation with regard to protecting the environment. So I am excited to have him here. He is the founder of a company called SilviaTerra, and he will tell us more about that. You've read some more in the bio as we jumped into it, but we will hand it over to him now.
Well, thanks for having me. It's virtually. So yeah, like you said, I live and breathe the world of forestry these days, which was not actually the world that I thought I was going to end up in when I went to Yale. I originally was a pre-med and then met my co-founder, a guy named Zach Paris at the School of Forestry. Yale sort of randomly has the oldest school of forestry in the United States. And yeah, it was created by Gifford Pinchot, who went on to be the first head of the United States Forest Service. Anyway, neither here nor there, but that was sort of my entrance to the world of forestry, was randomly getting a summer internship in a lab at the School of Forestry, working with Zach, who had figured out how to use satellite imagery to measure the sizes and species of trees and forests. And it seems like a very random area to spend your life on. But of course, this is something that people in the Bay Area right now are spending a lot of time thinking about: the wildfires around the Bay Area, and the carbon that's in trees, and the role that forests play in the climate. And so to me, that's really what got me into all of this to begin with, is just that forests are so fundamental for so many things in our lives, from the air we breathe, the materials that we build our houses out of, the wildfires, wildlife species habitat, water quality and quantity. All of these things come directly or indirectly from forests. And what was really shocking to me as an undergrad at Yale was to realize how unsophisticated a lot of forest management was. And it wasn't because there weren't smart people in forestry. It was because getting good data about forests has always been really, really complicated. It's always involved people going out into the woods with pencil and paper to literally go count trees. And so for the last 10 years, we've scaled up the work that Zach had originally done in his lab to use to help big industrial timber companies measure and monitor their forests. And so for us, one of the pictures that I'm really proud of that was sort of the capstone of a lot of the work that we had been doing, is this image that I'm sharing right now. And what you're going to see here is this is the first ever high resolution forest map of the entire United States. And so this is, took the work that we had been doing on sort of a project by project basis for big industrial timber companies and scaled that up to where we created a wall-to-wall inventory of the entire country, which had never been done before. That was sort of phase one of the dream all along. And so that was a big milestone that we achieved in partnership with Microsoft's AI for Earth program. That's actually the chief environmental officer of Microsoft, Lucas Joppa, there on the left, and then me and our co-founder, Zach. So just to give you a sense of exactly sort of what that looks like, this is a satellite image of a forest, and you can sort of see, where there's forest, where there's not forest. This is in California. And what we do is we sort of put a bunch of analytics and layers of data on top of that, from the satellite imagery and a bunch of machine learning stuff that we can get into in the questions if people are interested. But so this shows sort of the density of trees, but then we can also show the distribution of different species. And like I said, we have this across the entire United States. We're updating this every year. So we're measuring every acre every year. And there's a lot of technological things that go into making that possible. But what it actually means for landowners is we can now do sort of a Zillow for trees almost. So for any property in the United States, you can draw it on a map, and then we can sort of fill it in with our data. So right here, you're seeing the distribution of essentially timber volume across this property and the species composition on this property. And we can drill down even further to get down to, for each individual species, what's the diameter distribution. So, really for every acre, we have the size and species of a tree, which sounds kind of boring, but this is the data that foresters use to figure out how to value and manage forests, whether that's for timber or wildfire risk, or carbon, or any of these other values that we're talking about. It all ultimately depends on having these measurements to drive the decisions. And so from there, you can calculate these sort of next level of analytics. This is a map of carbon across the entire state of Arkansas. And we're really excited about making this data available to people and making beautiful maps like this. But really what's important here, and the data is important, but what's really valuable is the underlying forest, right? That's what we all actually care about. Now, the data is only instrumentally useful in such way that it helps us change how we value and measure that. And so for us, what was really exciting is using this data to drive markets for forest carbon. And so I wanted to walk you through a quick little story on a map that shows how this all plays out across the landscape with a pilot project that we ran with Microsoft in Pennsylvania. And so, like I said, this, all ultimately at the end of the day depends on having data for every acre every year from our base map. But let's zoom in to, this is McKean County in Pennsylvania. And this is one of the 6 counties that was included in our pilot project with Microsoft. Now, these are beautiful forests out in Pennsylvania, full of all these hardwoods. Cherry in particular is sort of the economic lifeblood of the region. And there's a long, long history of sawmilling these hardwoods into furniture, into flooring, all of these wood products that we use in our homes on a daily basis. And they're beautiful. And it's really an important part of the economics of the region. There's thousands and thousands of small landowners in these counties in Western Pennsylvania for whom the part of their livelihood. And so there's a scattering of across the county that these landowners can sell to. And what you'll see sort of populating here in the background in a second is a map of all of the different parcels in this county. And yeah, so it's coming in here now. And so each of these represents some distinct property. And you can see there's a huge mix of landowners in here, from really big to really small. And forest carbon markets are something that's just now coming online and is exciting for a lot of these landowners, but there's some real issues with making it actually work with real landowners on the landscape. But it's exciting because people have been selling timber for a long time, and now they have the potential to sell carbon. But only very few people can actually sell their carbon from forests right now. It takes 2 years and $200,000 to set up these projects. So only the biggest landowners can actually participate. Their costs pencil out. And so you can actually see on this map, it's the gray people here that have 5,000 plus acres of forest that make it even viable for them to participate. And so sort of cracking the code on how to make these carbon markets accessible to small landowners is really, really important for achieving the kind of scale of impact that people are talking about for carbon, but also for other values like wildlife. And so that's a big part of what we do, is because we're measuring every acre every year, it makes it possible to actually design market mechanisms that make it so that every landowner can participate in these forest carbon markets. And I'll give you just a really quick run through of exactly how that works. So sort of like that report that I showed you earlier in this call, for every property on the landscape, we have this detailed list of all the sizes and species of trees. So yeah, so that's this guy right here, but we have this for every property across the landscape. And like I said before, that allows us to quantify both the carbon on the property and the timber products there. How many tons of pulpwood, how many board feet of timber, all the stuff that drives the economic management of those forests. And so if you were just to take a snapshot today of the forest that exists on the landscape, this is more or less what you would see. So this is the total carbon on each of these properties in Western Pennsylvania. And if you just left it alone, if there was no timber harvest or anything, you would have a little bit more carbon at the end of the year. And actually, it's not that little amount of carbon. It's 1 million tons of carbon that would be additionally pulled out of the atmosphere by the trees in this single county in Western Pennsylvania in a single year. And so just to give you a sense of scale, that's equivalent to taking about 200,000 cars off the road for a year. So it's, we're talking about real real impact. But this is something actually that, as people that try things, actually, this is one of the places where I think a lot of people get really tripped up in carbon markets. Is it's not enough to just measure the carbon that's on every property. You also have to have a sense for, well, was there any risk that this timber was actually going to be harvested? Was this economically mature timber, or was this going to be forest no matter what? And it turns out that there's actually some very clear timber economics you can do. This is a net present value curve of a timber rotation. And not to get too into the weeds on timber economics right here, but suffice it to say that if you actually know the sizes and species of every tree on every acre, you can develop some economic models that give you a pretty good idea of what landowners are likely to do. And so you can identify across the landscape, where is carbon at risk of being harvested? And from a carbon perspective, what you want to do is you want to make payments to those landowners to say, tell you what, take some money, don't harvest your trees this year, and we'll talk again next year. And that's exactly what we've tried to build here. And so if you sort of zero everything out across the landscape and just say like, well, when you start paying landowners to defer their timber harvests for a year, how does that play out across the landscape over time? And so the answer is, well, it's a market-based thing. Every acre of forest is different, and every landowner has different economics. And so what this curve shows right here is that the amount of carbon that you can move on the landscape really depends on the price that you're willing to pay, which shouldn't be surprising, but is a thing that people sort of often forget, is that on every acre, carbon is competing against timber. And every landowner has their own sort of net present value curve, and each landowner needs to be moved from a harvest to a not harvest decision. And this is 50 cents a ton. If you're paying $1, much more carbon, and if you're paying $1.50 a ton, you get even more participation and more in-depth participation. And so, just to wrap it up, you apply this year over year over year, and you end up finding, where's the lowest cost carbon on the landscape each year? Where can I pay people to actually change their behavior? And that's over the course of a decade, you end up pulling down millions and millions of tons of carbon at the lowest possible price. And that's what we do. And excited to sort of talk more about that with you all. There's a lot of moving parts here. We wrote a 30-page white paper on forest carbon economics if you're having trouble falling asleep at night. But yeah, there's a lot of moving parts, but this really is one of the most, it's an important thing for our generation to get right. And our view is that we got to get the numbers, we got to get the math right. Otherwise it's all made up and the points don't matter. And that doesn't seem like that should be the plan. So I'll stop there.
Very good stuff. All right, we're going to do as we always do and shift to Q&A, but first I want to introduce the people who are on the call. So when I call your name, please wave at the camera or wink or whatever you need to do. Our membership chair, Farheen, is helping out, especially with the recording and all. Thank you, as always, Farheen. The farthest away award comes from Manu and Henry in Germany. Great to have you guys with us. And Manu, thank you for the connection that allowed us to get Max as a speaker. Gabby is in Salt Lake City and one of the newest members of the club. Our paella master, Shags Shagrin, is in Walnut Creek. Sandy Stabile, also in the Bay Area. Good to have you with us, and a tireless volunteer for Rotary efforts across the district. And then another one of our most recently won members to the team is Cal Mann of much Peace Corps work, and great to have this group with us. So we'll start the Q&A with one from Manu. So Manu, when you were thinking about bringing Max to the club, I'm sure there were a number of questions in your mind, and I'm thinking we're about to get to hear one of them. So go ahead.
That is true, Rushton. Well, first of all, thanks for sharing your story, Max. And as you guys can imagine, it's not only questions, but I'm a big fan to start with that. As Max said, it's a generational approach to make things evidence-based, right? But still, a question that only can arise out of Germany, which is century-long traditions in forestry. As much sense as this approach makes, how did people and agencies and landowners and whatever manage these things before? Like you said, it was done or still is done manually, but how can we imagine, how does anybody manage these huge amounts of data out there manually?
Yeah, well, it's tough. And, I mean, that's part of why there's a lot of, I'll call it suboptimal forest management that goes on out there right now. I mean, if you looked at CAL FIRE's fire risk maps, you would be like, wow, these are like not really down to the acre by acre level that we need to be making these forest management decisions on. So even though California, I mean, CAL FIRE has like $1 billion budget over 5 years to do forest management. And the thing is, if you got 100 million acres of forest in the state or whatever it is, $1 billion doesn't actually go that far, and you need to be a lot more targeted in what you're able to do. And because they're relying on, these sort of very coarse, field measurements of guys just going out in the woods and counting trees, and it's sort of a very coarse statistical sample. I mean, like, it gives you a good top level number, right? But it doesn't provide you with the level of detail that you need to make the actual tactical forest decision making. So that's one element of it. The other thing, just sort of at a high level, is timber has totally driven the boat on forest management because it's easy. It's easy to make timber work. You cut down a tree, put it on a logging truck, and you drive it across the scale at a timber mill, and you get paid by the ton. And it's really easy to measure and pay for value. And all this other stuff, it's just been impossible to measure and pay for. And so there's been tremendous market failure, unsurprisingly. And that's part of what we view our role is being able to provide the measurements to underpin the markets for these values that we're all desperate for. Like, lots of people in the Bay Area would be willing to pay their proportional share to stop these wildfires, but there's not a great mechanism to do that right now.
So in talking about developing a market, obviously one of the issues for any market is where's the capital, right? And so as we think about paying landowners not to harvest their timber, I would assume that over time there are actually a number of things that make it balance out. But looking specifically at the front end, where you're getting these kinds of things going, where do the funds come from to pay the landowners?
Sure. So a lot of it right now is coming from corporate actors like Microsoft, who have made these voluntary, carbon neutrality commitments. And, I mean, if you look at sort of the graph of the volume of these commitments, it's just like crazy up and to the right. And there's a lot of regulatory stuff coming online too, especially in Europe. So that's where the demand side money is coming from right now. And it's a combination of voluntary and regulatory, and it's something that it certainly slowed down a bit during COVID, but it's something that it's not going away. I mean, all these corporates have made these multi-decade commitments. And so, I think this is here to stay. It's really just a question of, are they going to have access to high quality carbon offsets that actually change management on the landscape, or are you just going to pay people to not cut down trees that they were never going to cut down in the first place?
I know that Cal has a question. So Cal, if you'll chip in.
Really interesting presentation. You used the word carbon, I assume kind of loosely for the purpose of the presentation. And so I want to understand a little more clearly, are you talking about how much carbon is being taken out of the atmosphere, for example, in the course of a year by the standing timber that's there? Or are you talking about the amount of carbon that's sequestered in all of the timber that's on that property or on that acre? Or are you talking about both?
Yeah. Or am I talking about CO2 equivalent? Or I mean, there's like a lot of moving parts here, and it is very important to like actually be specific when you get into the nitty gritty of the financials of all this type of stuff. And so your question is a good one, but it's actually not. It's a bit misguided actually. So to rephrase it, every year there's carbon that is kept in trees on the landscape that you can say, oh, I'll not cut down this tree this year, and so that chunk of carbon stays on the landscape. There's also the chunk of carbon that tree removes from the atmosphere that year by growing. And so this, some people call this the difference between a carbon removal from the atmosphere and an offset that you get from a deferred harvest or something. I actually think that that's a confusing and not productive way to look at it necessarily, because ultimately what you should care, like there's only two pools here. Like the only things you really should care about are what is the size of the forest carbon pool and what is the size of the atmospheric carbon pool. And so in that world, actually, the removals and the deferred emissions, from the timber harvest, those are actually, those are just two different operations that affect the size of the pool. But it's sort of important to keep your eye on eyes, right, and say like, well, we actually care about the total amount of forest carbon in forests across the whole U.S. And you don't actually even care about particular acres. You just care what is that big top level total number, and that's it starts to get sort of subtle. And I do just want to say that one thing that's a little bit sort of second order, a little counterintuitive, is that when you apply this mechanism that I talked about that pays people to defer their timber harvest across the whole landscape, what that does is it actually increases the average age of forests across the landscape. So instead of having an average age of, say, 20 years, the average age of forests might go to 21 years. And even though that's a very small absolute difference in the average, it actually represents an enormous amount of carbon across the landscape, which is what what as a society we should actually care about.
Max, let me build up on that. That's all global issues, right? And what do you feel? Is there a difference in different regions? I mean, we saw so many issues with forestry in Russia as well, and here in Europe and Australia and so on and so on. So will we end up with such an approach everywhere, or are different regions working differently on different economic models?
Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, carbon is the perfect commodity because there's only one atmosphere, and a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon is a ton of carbon. So in theory, the price of carbon globally actually should be totally equalized. In a sense, the way that this market is structured really does depend on the context in which it operates, because I said there's the carbon stock assessment, which is really important, but then the other key thing is that business as usual assessment. What was likely to happen? Was this timber actually at risk of harvest or evaporation in a wildfire or whatever? And that really depends on the economic situation on a sort of region by region basis and what the practice of forestry is. I mean, even just up in Canada, the practice of forestry is very different than it is in the United States because it's all crown land, and the way they work, there's not much private ownership of forest, and you get a lease from the crown to harvest timber for some defined period. And that drives a very different economic calculation than if you're actually owning the timber and owning the land. And so, the beautiful thing about forestry is it gets endlessly complicated, and that's part of what I love about it. But the short answer is like, yes, this mechanism will have to be adapted in different contexts because you're trying to create real change in a messy, complicated world. That's how it goes.
Cool. Gabby, I think you have a question.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was gonna kind of ask a similar question as well. Amazon, right? Like it's a big, complicated topic. And with your mindset and your studies, like what are your thoughts around, that side of the world, and how do we prevent some of that as well? Like, and what are some thoughts that you have around, that part of the world of who, because it contributes a lot of like, depolluting or giving us a lot more carbon, if you will.
Sure. So there's a lot of things actually wrapped up in that question. I mean, there's the pure carbon side of things. There's the carbon competing against things like conversion to rangeland side of things. And then there are the co-benefit side of things, which is like, well, we actually don't care about the rainforest just for carbon. We care about it for biodiversity and all this other stuff. My view is whenever you hear somebody talk about things like co-benefits, I say, like, let's not be hand wavy about that. Like, let's actually measure it and get some numbers and actually have functioning. So every co-benefit, I think, actually ultimately will be another type of market. So there will be markets for particular endangered species. There will be markets for water quality. There, like all of these types of things. If society values those, we should have a mechanism to pay landowners to change their behavior in such a way that we get more of this. Because one of the things that we like sort of philosophically believe at SilviaTerra is the best way to get more of what you want is to pay for what you want. But the problem is the mechanics of doing a lot of this stuff right now are very tricky and very expensive to get right, because your only option is to either buy the land or try to lock somebody up for some 100-year commitment or something that just like, it doesn't match with how the actual practice of forestry takes place. And like, you know, like literally right now, if you live in California, the California Air Resources Board makes forest landowners sign up for 100-year contracts that say we will maintain carbon above this threshold level for 100 years. I don't know what other 100-year contracts you guys have been signing lately. Like, yeah, it's a totally anomalous economic thing, and it requires that you have like great confidence about what the economics of 100 years from now, or 50 years, or it's just like, I know I'm not smart enough to predict the future. We just want to have a mechanism that gets the incentives right, so that like this year we get people moving in the right direction, and we don't have to spend a ton of money up front because we're renting the carbon instead of sort of buying it, and making big, bold predictions about what the future looks like. And it's like, hey, the iPhone came out 12 years ago. So like, I don't know what your guys' predictions for 2050 look like. So.
Fair enough. So as we always do, after we finish the recording, we'll keep asking questions. It's one of the benefits of being part of our community. You get a chance to meet interesting people doing interesting things and ask them cool questions. So if you are a member and you have not already done so, make sure that after finishing watching this, that you go down and you let us know you were here. There is an attendance piece, and it's important for us to know who's here each week. If you are a guest, doing that properly, as in putting in your email address with everything spelled the right way, will generate an email that you can pass along to your club secretary to make up a miss for your club. For everyone, we would like you to go down to the bottom of the screen where we have a discussion forum, and to let us know what your thoughts are. You might have had questions that we're about to ask ourselves in the group, right? As we continue on with the conversation after we finish. But we are, as we always do, we're going to hand it over to the speaker for a final word. And as we do that, all of our different participants are in that space of, what do I get to ask once the recording goes off? So Max, I hand it back to you. What is the final word you want our viewers to have in their heads when they walk away?
Yeah, I think I'd like to wrap up with just an idea about climate diplomacy, which is something that I keep on hearing about a lot as bills like the Trillion Trees Act or the Growing Natural Climate Solutions Act are proposed in Congress. To me, a mechanism like we're talking about here is actually a really unique way to sort of bridge a lot of the divides that we have in America, because a lot of the people that are very concerned about the climate and paying for carbon are on the coast, and a lot of the forests in America are in these rural areas that are not as concerned. But the thing is, like, markets allow people with very different ideas to collaborate and work together. And mechanisms like this allow everybody to be part of the climate solution in a really productive way and a really efficient way. And so it's an exciting time. And I think we'll start with carbon. And I think the same mechanism, like I said, can be applied for things like wildfire, or wildlife habitat, or any of the other values that we care about. And yeah, it's just exciting to play a small but very sort of technically and measurements focused role in this big problem.
All right, the low-key applause from Shags. Thank you. And everyone, we will see you next week.